Welcome to the Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling Podcast, the only wrestling show where the takes are hot, the receipts are ready, and today we're going full prestige documentary mode.
Because this is a big one.
This is our Wrestlemania Retrospective special. We're asking the legacy questions, we're doing rewatchables, but with body slams.
We're looking back at 3 historic, chaotic, legacy-defining shows.
WrestleMania 1, the original gamble. It either changes the business forever or Vince is selling tape libraries out of the trunk.
Oh. WrestleMania 9, Caesar's Palace, togas, politics, one of the weirdest endings in Mania history. Was it a disaster? Was it misunderstood? We're litigating it.
WrestleMania 25, the spectacle, the streak, the Shawn versus Taker masterpiece. Are we sure this isn't the greatest Mania match ever conversation?
We're asking the big legacy questions. Which one mattered most historically? Which one aged the best? Which one would we fix with 2026 hindsight? And where do these rank in the all-time WrestleMania pantheon?
Listen, an episode this big, we couldn't just go two-man booth.
That's right. Joe is back.
Triple threat mode activated. 3 mics, 3 egos, 0 safe takes.
We're drafting moments, we're rebooking finishes, we're probably overanalyzing entrances, and yes, somebody is absolutely going to defend WrestleMania 9 harder than they should.
And if that's not enough, we're breaking down WrestleMania 42 in full with in-depth analysis opinions.
This is Mr. and
Promotional consideration paid for by the following.
Okay, serious question. How do people let everyone know they're listening to the hottest wrestling podcast in the game?
That's easy. They stop yelling it at strangers in Target and they go to Pro Wrestling Tees.
Boom. See? Growth, maturity, merch?
That's right. The official Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling podcast shirts are live. Fresh designs, soft tees, drip approved.
Perfect for WrestleMania watch parties.
Perfect for AEW, WWE, TNA, and even New Japan Pro Wrestling pay-per-views.
Perfect for when you're cutting a promo in your living room.
Or when you're reminding your spouse you were right about that heel turn.
I was right.
Debatable.
What's not debatable? You need this shirt.
Head over to Pro Wrestling Tees and grab yours now.
Support the podcast.
Rep the brand.
And join the Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling family.
All right. We're kicking off the show with WrestleMania 1. WrestleMania, sequentially known as WrestleMania 1. It was the inaugural WrestleMania that took place on March 31st, 1985 at Madison Square Garden in New York City. The attendance for the event was 19,121. The event was seen by over 1 million viewers through a closed-circuit television, making it the largest pay-per-view showing of a wrestling event on closed-circuit television in the United States at the time. So the card starts off with a singles match. Tito Santana defeats the Executioner in 4 minutes and 49 seconds. Now, when I watched this back a few weeks ago, I didn't even realize it was WrestleMania 1 because it's been that long since I've seen it. Everything felt very robotic. Like the guy, I don't remember his name, he's the one in the middle. And he talks as they're like leaving and entering the ring to kind of like introduce the guys. What's his
Lord
name?
Alfred Hayes.
Lord Alfred Hayes. Like he did a really good job. You could tell he was there to like keep the show moving. But watching that back versus watching, the more recent years and even, WrestleManias right after that, it didn't have quite that huge feel to it, to me anyways, as somebody who's, newer to watching WrestleManias. But does anybody have any thoughts about this opening match? It was a shorty.
Yeah, I mean, Tito Santana was coming off of a huge run as Intercontinental Champion. His feud with Greg Valentine was massive in the New York area. And that's what they catered to at this time. New York City was the hub for WWF at the time, and that was their home base. So they knew how to cater to that crowd, and seeing guys like Tito Santana was exactly what they wanted to see.
Yeah, it was a standard match for that time period. I mean, the Executioner wasn't going to win. I believe that was Playboy Buddy Rose under the mask there. I think that's who that was, or Buddy Landau, I can't remember. But yeah, so just a standard match, nothing crazy. 2.5 stars. It's a standard opener.
Yep. Then we had a singles match, King Kong Bundy, which is what we named our Ford Explorer after. King Kong Bundy with the Mouth of the South, Jimmy Hart defeats SD Jones in 25 seconds. That's a squash match if I've ever seen one.
So this was the start to the build for WrestleMania 2. So this is, them starting to make Bundy the monster. And the rumor was at this time, could they get Harley Race to come over? Could they get Bruiser Brody to stop going to Japan and sign with the WWF? And Bundy was their next monster. And this is early Jimmy Hart when he was just coming from Memphis, coming from the First Family, where he managed King Kong Bundy. So it was a huge win for Bundy as well, because SD Jones in the early to mid 80s was a big part of that, New York territory.
Yeah, I mean, they build this match, I think, on the show as a 9-second victory for Bundy. But yeah, I mean, this, like Steve said, this was to build him for Hogan the following year. And that was a big win because, like Steve said, SD Jones was a huge part, of the early 80s there. So, I mean, that just kind of skyrocketed King Kong Bundy through the rest of that year leading into WrestleMania 2.
Yeah, we have the LJN action figure of him, but watching this match, I was just like, he is really big and really white. Like, he just looks like a big dead guy wrestling.
Oh, yeah.
Then we had a singles match. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat defeats Matt Bourne in 4 minutes and 39 seconds. This is our first but not last appearance of Matt Bourne for the episode.
Joe did a lot of research on Matt Bourne. So, Joe, what did you find out for our casual listeners?
Yeah, so those that aren't familiar, he was billed as Maniac Matt Bourne for most of his career. He passed away June 28, 2013 from an accidental drug overdose. He was 55 years old at the time. He had struggled with addiction for decades. He's a second generation wrestler, the son of Tough Tony Bourne, who was a legend in Portland, Oregon territory back in the 60s and 70s. Matt started in the Portland territory working for promoter Don Owen. He worked all over the world, but he would always bounce back to Portland over the years until the territory eventually dried up. He kind of hit it big in 78. He went to Mid-Atlantic Wrestling and formed a tag team with Buzz Sawyer. They eventually toured all over the world together as a team. In June of 1980, they beat Jimmy Snuka and the Iron Sheik to win the Mid-Atlantic Tag Team titles. A few months later, they lost the titles to the Sheep Herders, and they split up and went their separate ways. Major tag team titles that he had won, he was Mid-South Tag Champion, also with Ted DiBiase, Tag Champion with Arn Anderson in Georgia. He also held the world-class WCCW tag team titles with Buzz Sawyer and later with Jeff Jarrett. His major singles titles wins were the NWA Pacific Northwest Champion, World Class Championship Wrestling Texas Heavyweight Champion, and the Interworld Wrestling World Middleweight Championship, which was the South African territory back in, I believe, 1988. He also wrestled as Big Josh in WCW in the early 90s when he was let go. From there, he went back to the WWF, and that's when we'll get into the Doink the Clown character later on, which we will touch on more. I have more in depth that we'll get into when we get to that point.
Okay, that was a lot of information. Great job. Great researching.
Thank you.
So my favorite period of Matt Bourne was when he was in the Rat Pack in Mid-South. So the Rat Pack was a faction in Mid-South with Matt Bourne, Ted DiBiase, and somebody you didn't expect to be a bad guy, Jim Dugan. He wasn't known as Jim Duggan. He was Jim Dugan. Yeah,
Yep.
So he was a total bad guy in Mid-South. And, they had the 80s look, the dark sunglasses, the suits. They just fought everybody. And I always wondered why Bobby Heenan called him Dugan, but it was a throwback to Mid-South when they actually called him that.
Right.
But this was also the, one of the early introductions to Ricky Steamboat to the New York territory, coming off of the huge Starrcade match where him and Youngblood won the tag team titles from the Briscoe brothers. And this would start, again, Steamboat's, ascension into being a big time guy in pro wrestling, because from here he would start feuding with Jake Roberts, and that led to the huge Saturday Night's Main Event episode where he got the DDT on the outside. Steamboat got his skull like cracked and was legitimately knocked out in the match. And then that led to, the famous WrestleMania match with Randy Savage. So nice introduction for Steamboat. And, it showed, how talented Matt Bourne was. And even though this was only a 4 minute and 39-second match, even Dave Meltzer, now this is Dave Meltzer in 1985, he was a lot harder on, his ratings, still gave this 3.25 star, which is, very surprising for a match under 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, from a technical standpoint, this was the best match on the show without question. And Steamboat, a lot of people don't know, Steamboat was a competitive bodybuilder back in the 80s. So that's why he had that really, really jacked physique back then. He didn't, as the 80s wore on, he got out of the competitive side. So he leaned out a little bit. But yeah, he was a big dude back then, no doubt.
Then we had a singles match. I think this match was probably my favorite one, but we had Brutus Beefcake. This was before he was the barber, is that correct? With Johnny Valiant, and then David Sammartino, wrestling royalty, right? Because his dad, Bruno Sammartino, who was also there, and also the longest title holder, is that correct? 7 years. This was a double DQ, 11 minutes and 43 seconds. I think Johnny Valiant and Bruno Sammartino both got involved there at the end, and that kind of tanked the match. But I think for me, I loved it so much because it was just seeing the wrestling, from the era before this, which is like completely foreign to me, right? And Bruno Sammartino, and then seeing his son. And then I think I just loved seeing like that legacy sort of play out, but also like in awe of their physiques. Like David Sammartino was a brick shit house. Like he was just boxy, ripped. He looked just like his dad. And I think for me, it was just like a nice piece of history to watch. And this was the longest match so far, 11 minutes and 43 seconds. So does anybody have any thoughts about this match or anything you want to add to it?
Yeah, it was the longest match on the whole card, which is surprising. And, the casual fans may not know this, but Johnny Valiant was a big deal in the 70s. The tag team that he was in, his, tag team brother, Jerry Graham, was the, idol of Vince McMahon. So they went on to become like the Valiant brothers, and it was a huge deal. So having Sammartino and Valiant in the same, match, getting involved, it was huge for the New York area. It's something, they really remembered. And I always liked Luscious John Valiant. And if you don't know about him, look him up. The way he passed away was a horrible story, but we're going to see a lot of that throughout these retrospects.
Did he make it to Dark Side of the Ring or no?
It wasn't that bad. He got hit while he was riding his bike.
I thought it was like,
No,
yeah,
it wasn't.
that's
It wasn't
terrible.
Dark Side of the Ring. It was just like a crappy way to go.
Yeah, oof, that sucks. Moving on, we did have the WF Intercontinental title match. JYD, Junkyard Dog, one of my favorites, picks up the win against Greg Valentine. Now, is he Greg the Hammer Valentine at this point or just Greg Valentine? Okay. And we had, Jimmy Hart again, who is just so much fun to watch. He's just got so much energy even to this day. He's always jumping around and shouting, and like that hair like does not quit. It's never changed. But this match was a count out, 6 minutes and 55 seconds. Joe, what do you got about this match?
It wasn't anything special. I mean, Steve touched on it the first match. Valentine just had that big feud with Tito. They weren't going to beat him. They weren't going to beat JYD. This was their way out, and it wasn't anything special. It really didn't even get a chance to get going. And then Valentine just walks out. So it was just kind of
Yeah, I forgot that part.
it wasn't anything special. Nothing that anybody needs to go out of their way and rewatch for sure.
Yeah, I
Then
wish
we
they would have did the Santana Valentine match on this card. That would have been massive.
I agree.
If you would have just flipped that around, have JYD do the squash match in the opener, because at this time, I think JYD was, probably next to Snuka and Andre and Hogan. He was right up there as one of the top baby faces.
Yeah.
Him and Michael Hayes had the record in Mid-South for, the largest gate in the Superdome, and that was off of him. Mid-South, couldn't recover after losing JYD. He was their meal ticket, and the JYD from Mid-South to the JYD in the WF was totally different. So look at old JYD and you'll see why everybody made a big deal about him. But the one thing about Valentine that I remember most is during that time, what Vince McMahon was doing, and, call it what you want, but it was brilliant. He would call other promoters like Crockett and Mid-South and the AWA and get footage and show that on his weekly TV show. And based off the reactions and what people thought of this talent, that would determine what talent he was going to go after and try to steal from other promotions. And Valentine came off that huge run with Piper in the Crockett territory that led him to the WWF. So, both these guys were huge deals at this time in 85.
Then we had the WWF World Tag Team title match. Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik with Freddie Blassie, classy Freddie Blassie, right? And they beat Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda, which is dad. He was the IRS, right? He went on to be the IRS, and then he's the dad of the Wyatt brothers. Bray, rest in peace. And I don't know his name, Bo, but I don't know his name now. Uncle Howdy. And they had Captain Lou Albano in their corner. This match was 6 minutes and 55 seconds and a title change. And the talent in this match and the two greatest managers of all time on the outside. That's awesome. Why don't you tell me about it, guys?
This match had a lot of heat. I mean, Sheik and Volkov were really, really hated heels, in New York, the New York market. Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda, the U.S. Express. You can't really see it now, obviously, because of the licensing issues with the music, but they used to come out to Born in the USA. So that was a big song in the early to mid 80s there. So, and those two guys, actually all four of these guys, in-ring wrestlers, and Barry Windham went on to become NWA World Champion eventually, but and Iron Sheik was WWF champion. Volkov was a multiple-time tag champion. Mike Rotunda held singles titles in Mid Atlantic for years, and then he had the big tag team with Ted DiBiase. But yeah, I mean this was a good, as short as it was a fun match. Meltzer gave it 3 stars. I think they could have let it go a little bit longer, but it was fun to watch. Going back and rewatching it, I enjoyed that match a lot.
Yeah, having Blassie and Albano on the outside again just shows you 1980. There's managers all over pro wrestling, and just on this card, you had 3 of probably top 5 managers of all time on one card. Nobody had more tag champions than Captain Lou at the time, and them winning the titles here broke that record for him. And then the following year, you had him with the Bulldogs. So tag team wrestling was always with Albano. And, at the time, I think he was just about to become Super Mario. So it was a big deal. And he just came off of the whole Cyndi Lauper music videos where he always played her dad. So, he was a big deal here in 1985.
Yeah, and Blassie, I mean, he was a legend in San Francisco territory, wrestling for promoter Roy Shire. He was always a draw wherever he went, but that's where he made his name was over in the San Francisco territory.
Yeah, and everyone always said that Muhammad Ali copied Gorgeous George, but he actually copied Classy Freddie Blassie because Gorgeous George was way before his time. So it was Freddie Blassie in the San Francisco territory calling everybody pencil neck geeks. He laid the groundwork for Muhammad Ali and his trash talking. So, these guys were huge pioneers in pro wrestling.
The next match is Andre's career versus the $15,000 body slam match. Andre the Giant beats Big John Studd with Bobby the Brain Heenan in 5 minutes and 53 seconds. Now, Steve, do you feel like this was the beginning of the end for Andre?
Yeah. They had just shaved Andre's head, so he didn't have the giant afro anymore. And, I think this was like the last singles match where Andre could hold his own and, really look like Andre the Giant without, those limitations. I always felt WrestleMania 2 was like the end because by the end of that battle royal, he just looked like he was done. And we all know he had to have that massive back surgery not too long after WrestleMania 2. So, yeah, sad to see because Andre was, the backbone of pro wrestling for a long time. And he was, just getting, this feud and this, company really off the ground being one of the go-tos. And with John Studd, he was a big deal as a heel and someone that always claimed to be 7 foot, but Andre always hated that because He was really probably like 6'9", 6'10", and Andre would take it out on him, pulling his hair and actually punching him, farting on him and stuff while he would sit on him in the ring. But they had this challenge going for several months where Bobby Heenan would challenge, anybody to come in and try to slam Stud, and nobody could do it. They had Tony Atlas and all the strong guys at the time try to do it, but the only person that could do it was Andre, and then after this, Hulk.
Yeah, I mean, the match wasn't anything special, but when you put those stipulations, especially back then, that was a big deal for that audience, So, and he got the big pop when he slammed him finally. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm on the same page as Steve. This was really, and you could tell he had really slowed down, even in this match as to some of the stuff he was doing prior. So, and I think a lot of it too, the travel just got to him because he was essentially being booked all over the world as an attraction. So that poor guy had to ride in airplanes constantly, and he could barely fit in them. So, yeah, I'm with Steve. I think this was kind of the last time he was really able to, I guess take care of himself in the ring, not be carried by somebody else or a tag partner.
Then we had the WWF World Women's Title match. Wendy Richter with Cyndi Lauper and David Wolf defeats Leilani Kai with the Fabulous Moolah in 6 minutes and 14 seconds. This was definitely felt like the start of WWF at the time. Them using celebrities, in their big, shows, and Cyndi Lauper, I mean, it was the 80s. Come on. Like, she's one of your favorites, right, babe?
Yeah, Cyndi Lauper was huge. She always had wrestlers in her music videos. Captain Lou was like her manager, in story. And, she was heavily involved with the MTV WWF crossover that happened at this time when MTV was just getting off the ground. They relied heavily on the WWF and vice versa at this time. This was how the WWF became cool because they had people like Cyndi Lauper coming in. And the fact that a women's match was even showcased in a card like this was a big deal in the 80s because, after this, you didn't really have too many more women's matches on the cards other than, the occasional mixed tag with, Sherry in it.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the women's title back then was it was basically booked through Moolah. If you ever watched back in that era, rarely, and I mean rarely, did anybody that wasn't a Moolah girl get near that title. So, I mean, if you go back through the history books of that time frame and before that, I mean, that was the Moolah title. Whether she held it or not, it was either her or one of her girls held that title. That's a fascinating subject to read up on if anybody ever wants to dive into that. It's very interesting. And it's part of the reason why for years and years, the WWF did not feature female talent. So it's just something to think about, something if anybody ever wants to just, go down a rabbit hole, that's an interesting one to go to. The match itself was there. It wasn't anything special. It was a showcase to get Wendy Richter over by using Cyndi Lauper and the theme music, that she came out to. Girls Just Want to Have Fun. So that was all, like Steve said, the MTV rock and wrestling, with WWF.
Then we had the final match, the main event. It was a tag team match. Muhammad Ali was the special enforcer on the outside. Liberace with the Rockettes, Levitt was the guest timekeeper. Billy Martin, former manager of the Yankees, was the guest ring announcer, and Pat Patterson was the guest referee. This match was Hulk Hogan and Mr. T with Jimmy Snuka. They picked up the win against Paul Orndorff and my favorite of all time, Rowdy Roddy Piper, with Bob Orton. This match was 13 minutes and 34 seconds. Talk about your love of the entertainment in this match, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, it was the first time you got like the pop and circumstance in a show like this. Like you always, would have one-off celebrities, at wrestling, maybe getting involved, maybe a special enforcer or, referee or anything like that. But to have, somebody like Muhammad Ali at this time, huge deal. He was a few years removed from, being done boxing. Liberace was a big deal at the time. And in the New York area, Billy Martin was, the end all be all because the last time they won a title, Billy Martin was the manager. And Pat Patterson had one of his greatest matches in New York City against Sergeant Slaughter in their boot camp match. So, huge match. And, looking at it now, look at the talent in this ring. Everybody in this match is a Hall of Famer. Hogan, Mr. T, Jimmy Snuka, Paul Orndorff, Roddy Piper, Cowboy Bob, Pat Patterson, all Hall of Famers. And,
And Muhammad
42
Ali.
and Ali. Yeah. And 41 years later, Cowboy Bob's son, he's in the main event of WrestleMania this year. So it just shows you, this was huge. And at the time, there was nobody more popular on TV than Mr. T. I mean, the A team was huge at this time, and Hulkamania was really, just gaining like super speed here. Jimmy Snuka was one of the most over guys in New York. He had that massive feud with Morocco that was gigantic in New York. That was headlining cards, before Hogan got there. So that was a big deal. And Piper could talk with anybody at this time. And when Piper first came into WWF, he wasn't even a wrestler. He was just going to be a manager. But he was, so good at what he was doing, people wanted to see him get beat up. And it just led to this massive Hogan Piper feud that would travel through multiple companies, multiple decades, and was a talking point for their entire careers.
Yeah, I mean, it was a spectacle. The match was fine for what it needed to accomplish. What I found hilarious as I rewatched this, there had to be between photographers, security guards, New York City police officers, all the special guests, the WWF, producers, agents at ringside. There had to be, I'm not even kidding you, 100 people at ringside for that match. I'm just like, there was so many people, and you never see it today, but it's just like that was just so wild just to see, all that cluster down there. Those guys, they had to have Pat Patterson referee that, because back then, you probably don't know, a lot of those referees that they used, some of them were from athletic commissions, and some of them were just territory referees. So they had to have Patterson referee that match. I don't think any of their refs could have handled that back then. But no, it was great. It was a spectacle. It accomplished what it needed to, and it kicked off WWF to new highs going forward.
All right, so that's WrestleMania 1, the high stakes casino bet that paid off. If this fails, wrestling might look completely different today show. MTV energy, celebrity chaos, Vince basically pushing all his chips to the center of the table.
Now fast forward 8 years. The business is bigger, but also weirder. The cartoon era is in full swing. Steroids are in the headlines. The golden age glow, it's flickering a little.
And instead of Madison Square Garden grit, we get togas.
Woo, come on, guys. Caesar's Palace, outdoor afternoon vibes, Roman columns, a main event that turns into one of the most debated political chess moves in company history. We go from the birth of an empire to what exactly were they thinking. Let's jump in to the fever dream that is WrestleMania 9. WrestleMania 9 was the 9th annual WrestleMania, and it took place on April 4th, 93 at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. It was the first WrestleMania event held outdoors. The event was attended by 16,891 fans who paid a total of Just kidding. Who paid a total of $1,100,000 in admission fees. This represents less than 1/3 of the number of fans at WrestleMania 8, which had an attendance of 62,167. The pay-per-view drew a 2.3 buy rate, which is lower than the previous year's 2.8 buy rate. It was higher, however, than the buy rates for any of the following 4 WrestleManias. This is my all-time, can you hear me?
Yep.
This is my all-time favorite WrestleMania because it was so freaking weird. It was so different than anything we had ever seen from that point and since that point. Like it was just I loved it. I mean, the Giant Gonzalez, like who let that guy into the show in a naked hairsuit? Like it was such a weird WrestleMania. And then Hulk Hogan with that crazy eye because he got punched by Macho Man or something the night before. Anyways, let me stick to the script here. But first we had that WWF Intercontinental title match. Tatanka with Sensational Sherry picks up the win against Shawn Michaels in his Stephanie Tanner era with Luna Vachon by countout in 18 minutes and 13 seconds. You know, Tatanka, he was great. I mean, Shawn Michaels was also great. I don't know what to say about this match, but where are we in the story of HBK at this point in time?
So he was right in the middle of his first title run. So shortly after SummerSlam 92, he beat a departing British Bulldog to become Intercontinental Champion. And then, fast forward probably about 6 months later, here we are. He had the falling out with Sensational Sherry, and she was kind of stalking him at this time. And Michaels wasn't really with Luna, but Luna was following him around. So, people didn't really know what to make of it. Tatanka was a big deal. He was, undefeated at this time, hadn't lost to anybody. And, Shawn Michaels, we knew he was good, but we didn't know he was going to become what he was going to become. But this was a really good match. And I wish they would have, given the title to Tatanka or swapped this card around. I'll get into my theories later in the card, but I feel like if we would have swapped spots a little later, it might have been a better match. But the first two matches of this show were the best matches on the entire card.
Yeah, I'm with Steve. In terms of where Shawn was, I think Shawn was still finding his character. He hadn't been HBK for a little bit over a year, I think, at that point, year and a half maybe. So, he was still kind of finding himself. He was always, a good in-ring guy, but he was trying to put all that together, which he eventually did, and obviously Hall of Fame careers. Yeah, I'm with Steve there. I think you could have made some switches here, but overall it was a solid match. I think it went a little long, and they were focused a little bit too much on the girls on the outside as opposed to what was going on in the ring. But it was fine as an opener. Didn't like the finish, but it is what it is.
It wouldn't
So
be
in
WWE if it wasn't a non-finish.
So in Shawn Michaels' entrance music, the girl that's doing all the like moaning and stuff, is that Sensational Sherry? So fun fact, Joe, probably like a year ago, I was today years old when I realized that was Sensational Sherry and not birds. I thought it was a flock of birds in his entrance music.
Well, his
Listen.
original entrance music, she sang the whole thing, and then they changed it up to him.
Okay, that's hilarious. All right, moving on. We had a tag team match. We had the Steiner brothers, Rick Steiner and Scott Steiner, pick up the win against the Head Shrinkers, which is Fatu and Samu with Afa. This match was 14 minutes and 22 seconds. Any thoughts? Steve, you want to go?
So Fatu became Rikishi later on. So to me, this tag team match screamed WCW. This felt like a WCW tag team match. It was my favorite match on the show. And this card was also the debut of Jim Ross. So we got to hear Jim Ross as an 8-year-old at this time. I had just discovered Jim Ross in the summer of 92 with Jesse Ventura and WCW. So being able to see the Steiners go from WCW to the WWF, it was a big deal. And, both these tag teams were awesome, and they delivered what I thought was a great match. Meltzer only gave it 2.5 stars, but I really enjoyed it and thought it was the best match on the card.
Fun fact, Mayor, the Head Shrinkers wrestled in WCW as the Samoan SWAT team, and their manager was Paul Heyman. So little fun
Oh,
fact there.
really?
Yeah, as Paulie Dangerously. But yeah, I thought this was a good match. The one thing that really stood out was that nasty bump that Steiner took to the outside. There's definitely a miscommunication there somewhere because he took a header to the outside, and you could tell he was hurting. But yeah, I mean, I figured even back then watching this, I figured the Steiner brothers were gonna win this match, and they did.
I do love me some Jim Ross, and he was so cute in his little toga, and he was like such a baby. Like even his voice was higher back then. Like he was just so young, and like I don't know, I loved him in this WrestleMania. I think for me, this WrestleMania was the first time that I was like super excited about wrestling because I didn't watch it obviously when we were 8 years old because Steve and I are the same age, but of course I watched it after when we were just newly together, I think. And This was the first WrestleMania that had me really excited about wrestling, and the Steiner brothers and the head shrinkers, like, to me, it was just very colorful. And I was like, what do you mean that's Scott Steiner? Like, he doesn't look like a freakazoid, and this match, I mean, it's one of the matches I remember vividly just because, of their gear and yeah. The next match was Doink and Crush. Doink picks up the win. Now, Doink is Matt Bourne. Is that what you guys were saying earlier? So there's going to
Yes.
be some more Matt Bourne talk, right? Who is Doink at this point?
Doink was Matt Bourne. He was obviously best known as the original Doink in WWF. His best match during that run was his match against Bret Hart at SummerSlam in '93. Tremendous match. Go back and watch it if you ever want to. It's really good. He was fired toward the end of '93 for failing a drug test, which we talked about earlier. He had substance abuse issues. So there were 4 Doinks. Okay, so when Matt Bourne got fired, Ray Apollo was the guy that played Doink the most. Also, Steve Kern and Steve Lombardi, who was known as the Brooklyn Brawler, they also portrayed Doink. And back then, Mayor, they would run sometimes 3 or 4 house shows in the same night in different areas, different cities. So they could have a Doink the Clown on each show. So that was part of the reason why they did that. The other reason why they did that too is the initial pitch was for there to be 2 Doinks as a tag team, which Bourne really fought heavily against Vince McMahon for. So after he gets fired at the end of '93, he went to ECW in his Doink the Clown gimmick. He lost to Shane Douglas with the idea of bringing back Born Again Matt Bourne. But then as that was progressing, Bourne never came back. He took an offer to go to Germany to work for Otto Wanz for more money. And then once that finished up, he just kind of wrestled independence in the U.S. off and on for the rest of his career up until he was still wrestling a couple nights a week until he passed away. And then I have one more fun little fact that I didn't even know about until I started looking this stuff up. So he was really good friends with Jesse Ventura. That's who actually talked him into getting into the wrestling business when Jesse was working the Portland territory. And he also let me find it here. He actually helped break in Dustin Rhodes into the wrestling business when he was wrestling in Texas. And Matt Bourne also was the travel partner of Ken Shamrock back in the mid to late 80s. A lot of people don't know Ken Shamrock started as a pro wrestler before he got into MMA. So just a couple little fun little facts there that I thought people might find interesting.
I only know Ken Shamrock as a wrestler. I had no idea he was in MMA, so that's pretty cool.
One of the pioneers of UFC.
Who knew? You guys, I didn't. The next match we had was Razor Ramon against Bob Backlund. This match was 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Bob Backlund was like such a character to me. Like, he was very cartoony to me in his movements, but I think that's just how I saw him. But Steve talked to me about this match. It was a very short match. I don't even remember it, and I've watched this WrestleMania like a million times.
Yeah, it was very quick. Bob Backlund had just recently come back to the WWF after like an 8-year layoff from when he lost the world title, and then he came back, I think, a little bit right before the Royal Rumble. But they were really trying to get Razor Ramon going. It wasn't too long after this where they switched Razor to then be a good guy after the infamous 1-2-3 Kid match. But it is what it is. It was just a quick match, a way to get over Razor, and Bob Backlund, got one final run in WWF.
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought he would end up beating, Bret Hart for the WWF title there? That's crazy when you think back on that. But yeah, it was to establish Razor, get him a win against a big name. I think it was you could kind of tell a lot of that generation didn't really know who Bob Backlund was, because he had been gone for so long, and that was an entire generation, of fans that either stopped watching altogether or those fans just kind of were older and weren't watching anymore. So yeah, it served its purpose. It was fine for what it was.
Next, we had the WWF World Tag Team Title match. This was Money Inc., which was Erwin R. Shyster and Ted
IRS.
Duh. And Ted DiBiase picking up the win against the Mega Maniacs. So Brutus Beefcake and Hulk Hogan with Jimmy Hart. This was a DQ finish, 18 minutes and 27 seconds. Steve, let's talk about that eye.
Yeah, so this was the big talking point, obviously when the match started, but all along the dirt sheets and after the fact, I mean, everybody, has a story about it. What they, and what Hogan always said was it was a jet ski accident. What the dirt sheets and a lot of people said was, Macho Man, found out Elizabeth was with Hogan and his wife, just staying at their house, and Macho Man confronted him and punched him in the face. It was never confirmed, but that was always the rumor.
Yeah, no,
How did,
no one's ever going to know the true story, especially now that Hulk and Savage are both gone. So
how did Vince feel about that black eye?
he initially wasn't going to let him wrestle. I think it was either the day of or the day before the WWF doctors cleared him. But they had a pretty much a strict don't go anywhere near his eye because I think it was a broken orbital bone is what it was.
It looked gruesome.
Oh, yeah.
Then we
Yeah.
had go ahead.
So the thing about this match is Hulk Hogan hadn't been in a wrestling ring in over a year, and Brutus Beefcake, it had been what, 3 years since he was in a wrestling match. So
he got seriously hurt before. That's why he was gone for a while. They had to reconstruct his face when he had his jet ski accident.
Yeah, so he was walking along the beach, and a parasailer,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, a parasailer collided with his face.
God, what
Yeah.
the heck?
So their knees went right into his face, going like 80 miles an hour. And
Yeah.
like they said his face was like just a puddle of bones and blood and mush. It looked like, bloody mashed potatoes. And he was on the verge of getting an Intercontinental title run when all of this happened, because he was just entering a huge feud with Mr. Perfect, and that got all shut down. His whole career got shut down because they had to spend, like 15 hours reconstructing his face, bone by bone, piece by piece. And his whole face is like titanium now.
And he's still alive now? I mean, I know he survived
Yep.
that because I've seen him wrestle, but that's insane.
Yep.
Wow.
Watch the Dark Side of the Ring on him if you haven't seen it. It's wild. They reenact the accident too, which is pretty cool.
The Chris Benoit run ruined me, so I haven't seen many since then. Then we had a singles match. Lex Luger picks up the win against Mr. Perfect, 10 minutes and 56 seconds. Lex Luger always looks like MacGyver to me, which was my very first crush when I was 3 years old. And Mr. Perfect is Mr. Perfect. Like, what can we say? Do you guys have anything to talk about when it comes to this match? Are they in the middle of any sort of feud or?
No, so this was
Luger.
this was Luger's first WWF match. And Mr. Perfect had just come back to wrestling 6 months earlier as a good guy. But this is where I was talking about earlier, where I would have switched the card up. I would have had Lex Luger battling Tatanka in the opening match, or Shawn Michaels versus Mr. Perfect in the opening match. I think Shawn and Perfect at WrestleMania at this time would have been an outstanding match, or, pun intended, a perfect match, because, Mr. Perfect was everything Shawn Michaels, was hoping to be as a pro wrestler. And I think Lex Luger versus Tatanka would have been a much better match, as far as you could have a DQ finish or a count out there and no harm, no foul. But I really think Perfect and Michaels, had they done this here, would have been a way better match at this time in their careers.
Yeah, they set that up, actually, that match up after,
Yeah.
With Michaels attacking Hennig, or Mr. Perfect, Hennig in the back. And then we did get that match at SummerSlam, in August that year. So, but yeah, I agree that would have made more sense, especially for this show, and the pacing of the card as well.
Then we had my favorite match, the Piece of Resistance. Just kidding. Is this the start of the streak, or no? It started a year or two before.
2 years earlier.
Okay, so we had Undertaker with Paul Bearer picking up the win against the Giant Gonzalez with Harvey Whippleman by DQ in 7 minutes and 33 seconds. When this match came on, I was like, what? Who? Why? Like, I don't understand how the Giant Gonzalez ended up on this card and who dressed him. It just doesn't make any sense, but it is one of the things that is so endearing about this WrestleMania because it's so freaking weird.
Yeah, it was Undertaker's least favorite opponent in his career. He's openly talked about how he hated wrestling. His name was George, Giant Gonzalez. And he said he would always say to him, "You can do whatever you want to me. You can chop me, kick me, throw me around, no big deal. Just don't hit me in the back of the head." And when he would like lean him down and do those clubbing, forearms, if you watch, it was always to the back of the head. and the Undertaker would lose his cool every match and just start, throwing rights and lefts right in his face to, give it to him. And, I'm glad you liked the spectacle of this match. As someone who watched Giant Gonzalez as El Gigante, this was awful. I mean, this you talk about the streak. This is the streak of horrible Undertaker opponents where he just had crap opponent after crap opponent. He started out with Snuka, Jake the Snake, then he went to Giant Gonzalez, and then he didn't wrestle at WrestleMania 10. Then at 11 he had King Kong Bundy. So, he had a string of, crap matches at WrestleMania. So, of course he was going to win. But yeah, this was more of like the kid friendly and cartoon characters part of WWE or WWF at the time.
Yeah, I mean, real quick, there actually almost wasn't a streak because initially when this match was booked, they had Giant Gonzalez going over.
That's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
yeah.
In
So
that
they
outfit? I don't think
they
so.
they they changed their mind. I think once they realized, he was just not very good, they changed their minds because Vince never watched anything else. He never watched WCW. So he saw the guy's size, and then when he realized he couldn't do anything in the ring, they changed it. So
I mean, who let him go out in that outfit? I know I keep talking about it. It was just a crazy, crazy match. It didn't feel like it belonged, but I digress. It was pretty funny to watch. Then we had the WWF World Heavyweight title match. Yokozuna with Mr. Fuji defeats Bret the Hitman Hart in 8 minutes and 55 seconds. So that's a title change. And then we have another match right after. Hulk Hogan picks up the win against Yokozuna with Mr. Fuji in 21 seconds, and he picks up the title. So he ends WrestleMania as the champ again. What is that?
Vince McMahon had one rule, and that was Hogan must pose. At the end of his show, he needed to see Hulk Hogan posing, so, go back to the well, and, it is what it is. It didn't make sense. 8-year-old me absolutely loved it because I was a Hulkamaniac through and through. So I thought it was the greatest day on earth because he came back, didn't win the tag titles, but won the world title, which was awesome. But as far as the Yoko and Brett match, I thought this was Yokozuna's best match ever. Brett, was in his prime right here, and he made Yoko look great. And this was the start of the decline for Yokozuna because he just let his weight just keep getting worse and worse and worse, and it made it harder and harder for him. So, it is what it is, but this was the beginning of the end of Hulkamania and WF.
yeah, so a little bit of backstory here. I'll keep it short. So Hogan came back. Him and Vince felt he should be the champion. The agreement was because he legitimately wanted to retire. Ticket sales were not good. They talked him into coming back. So the agreement was that he would put Bret Hart over at SummerSlam. That was the initial agreement. So, and what ended up happening is after this match, Hogan goes back to Japan as WWF champion. He's wrestling over there. They do press conference, and he basically calls the WWF title second fiddle to the New Japan heavyweight title. So that makes it gets back to Vince. They have a falling out, gets mad and says, well, I'm not going to stay till SummerSlam. And he drops the belt back to Yokozuna at King of the Ring in June. And then Hulk was done with pro wrestling until Eric Bischoff convinced him to come out of retirement in 94 to go to WCW. So that was a little bit of the backstory there on what all happened with that.
I don't remember the first time I saw Yokozuna, but this may have been it. This might have been the first time. I don't know. But it was the first time I was like, oh, wait, not everybody does look the same in WWF. Like it was, very, Vince had a prototype, steroids, big, buff, ripped, or spectacle. And I mean, Yokozuna kind of is that sumo wrestling spectacle. Yeah, I enjoyed watching Yokozuna, and I liked Mr. Fuji. All right, so that was part 1, WrestleMania 1 and 9, basically the figuring it out era. You've got chaos, weird booking decisions, and honestly some choices that feel like they were made at 2 a.m. after zero sleep and a couple of bad ideas.
But don't go anywhere because part 2, where it all gets next level. We're jumping to WrestleMania 25 and giving you the full preview of this year's 2-night WrestleMania 42 in Las Vegas, Nevada. Yeah, Things are about to get huge.
Make sure you're following us on social so you don't miss a second. We're on Instagram at Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling Pod, YouTube, Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling Pod, X, WrestlePod, Facebook, TikTok. Email us, Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling Pod at gmail.com. Part 2 drops soon, so get ready because the chaos is just getting started.
Hold up. Before we start the show, we gotta address something.
Yeah, the fact that you still don't own our merch.
Disrespectful, honestly. You listen every week. You yell at your phone when I'm right.
You mean when you think you're right?
Either way, you're not repping the brand. That's a problem.
Big problem, because the Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling podcast shirts on Pro Wrestling Tees, main event material.
Soft, comfortable, championship level drip.
Perfect for Raw, perfect for Dynamite, perfect for sitting on the couch judging creative decisions like you book the territory.
And let's be honest, when you walk into a show wearing our logo,
You're basically saying I've got elite taste.
who's your favorite wrestling podcast?
Who runs the hot takes?
Who brings the chaos every week?
Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling. So stop playing.
Search Mr. and Mrs. Wrestling on Pro Wrestling Tees.
Grab the shirt
Join the movement.
and look better than Mr. Wrestling while you're at it.
Okay, wow. We're ending strong.
We are ending strong in our merch.